the future of college sports is with athletes as employees.
Today's guest is Professor John T. Holden, who is a business professor at Indiana University who specializes in sports betting, gambling, and legal and regulatory issues in college sports. So, John, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Jesse.
Now, where to even start with college sports seems like a pretty insane question. Basically, since 1972, we had Title IX in 1972, but in the last 5 years, there's been so many different things, whether it's the NIL, the transfer portal, the realignment of conferences. I mean, you could go on and on. So for people that maybe aren't kind of initiated, do you just want to kind of break down some of the highlights that we've had in the last, 5 years or 5 days at this point? Who knows? It's just constantly changing, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really accurate way of looking at it. I mean, if someone was asleep for the last really 3 years, they would wake up and have no idea what college sports looks like. And I think a lot of our big changes in college sports, we can really trace back to June 2021. And we had sort of 2.5 monumental events in June 2021. The first was the Supreme Court issued their decision in the Alston case. And the Alston case, contrary to a lot of what's out there, wasn't actually about NIL or name, image, and likeness payments to athletes. The Alston case was about all the NCAA members getting together and agreeing to place a limit on how much academically related aid schools could give to athletes. And what the Supreme Court said is that violates the Sherman Act, right, which is sort of our primary federal antitrust law that stops combinations of businesses from getting together and imposing restraints on trade or engaging in anti-competitive behavior. And what they said was effectively, when the schools that are members of the NCAA get together and agree on a rule that restrains compensation, it's just like other businesses getting together and agreeing to cap wages on employees, agreeing not to pay people more than a certain amount. And so they said, yeah, that behavior violates antitrust laws. That decision, which was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, was accompanied by a concurrence by Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence really stole the thunder of the main opinion, because he essentially invited more lawsuits. He was like, we're ruling on this narrow rule that the NCAA has capping academically related aid, but there's probably other rules out there. And he concluded this concurrence with the now famous statement, quote unquote, the NCAA is not above the law. And so what that basically said to some athletes and a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys out there was, yeah, let's file these lawsuits. Let's challenge these other restraints, because the NCAA's restriction on academically related aid really isn't that different from their eligibility restrictions or their other restrictions on what you can do and what you can't do. So that really has ushered in a lot of other lawsuits, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in the coming minutes. The other major event that happened in June of 2021 was, you sort of have to go back to 2019, and California becomes the first state to pass a law that effectively says, nah, if you go to college in the state of California, or even if you're playing on a team that's competing in California, then you have the right, like any other citizen of California, to sell your name, image, and likeness rights, monetize your right of publicity. This is something that anyone else in California can do. Movie stars, actors, all sorts of people, other athletes do this. They strike deals with Cheerios or Nike or any of these other companies, but the NCAA restrained college athletes from doing this. And California finally was the first to say no. And shortly after that, Florida said, whoa, if California's doing this, we got to do this too, because else everyone else is going to go to school in California and our schools won't be competitive. So it's kind of interesting because California came at really from sort of athletes' rights perspective. And then what followed was a very rapid snowball of a lot of states fearing a lack of competitive advantage if they didn't do this. So all those laws that were passed between 2019 and 2021 had an effective date basically of July 1st, 2021. So California's law didn't immediately push the NCAA to do anything. It left open the opportunity that they could make changes. Well, after about 20 plus states passed these laws, the NCAA was really backed into a corner and no one knew what they were going to do. We weren't sure if they were going to sue the states, sue California, seek an injunction, if they'd come up with something else. And what they did was basically around 4:30 Eastern time on June 30th, under 8 hours from this law becoming effective, they released an interim policy that basically said, have at it. We defer to state law as to athletes' ability to monetize their name, image, and likeness. We'll take a back seat. They did issue some guidelines basically saying you couldn't use it to induce people to play for a particular school. You couldn't reward on-field performance through it. But really, they deferred to the states, and that actually meant that a lot of states had more strict requirements than the NCAA itself. So that really was the starting point for how we got here.
Where does the House versus NCAA settlement kind of fit into that? I mean, that went into effect July 1st, 2025. So we're talking like, a week ago or a little bit more.
It did. So the House settlement was actually going on concurrently with the Alston case, but it was a few years behind the Alston case. And the House plaintiffs were largely composed of former NCAA athletes who thought that the NCAA owed them money because it had monetized their name, image, and likeness through television broadcasting deals in the past. And so it was eventually combined with a case involving, the named plaintiff was Chuba Hubbard, who was a running back at Oklahoma State. I had a career year, and his class was challenging the fact that they did not receive NIL payments. And then there was a third class called the Carter class, and that was all combined under the House settlement. The Carter class actually went after a lot of the NCAA's other rules on earning. So the Carter class was probably the most significant challenge to NCAA earning restrictions, but they all got lumped under House, who was actually a college swimmer. And so the House case is this monumental challenge to NCAA restrictions on athletes earning money directly from schools. And what ends up happening is, kind of out of the blue, the NCAA and the plaintiff's attorneys, a famous antitrust litigator called Jeff Kessler and Steve Berman, announced that they've reached a tentative settlement. And the tentative settlement will let college athletes, subject to schools agreeing to it, basically receive somewhere between $20 and $22 million total payments each year. And that's sort of the big highlight of the House settlement. It comes with a few other things, though, that were sticky issues for the court to actually approve the settlement. And one of those was it will actually reduce the number of roster spots in some sports. And Judge Claudia Wilkin of California was concerned about what would happen to athletes who are currently on the roster that would lose their spots as a result of the settlement. And so the NCAA and the plaintiffs basically came back and they tweaked some of the language that was enough to satisfy Judge Wilkin, who ends up approving this settlement. So what we have sort of, we're basically at the time of recording this about 5 weeks out from kickoff in the 2025 college football season that is going to see athletes receiving cash payments from their institutions for the first time, at least above board, in 100 years, which is pretty incredible.
So, John, are these student athletes still, quote unquote student athletes, or are they employees? Are they professionals? I mean, and then how does this is basically just going to have or open the door to more lawsuits, right? Like, this is supposed to provide clarity, but it seems like it's just going to create even more lawsuits.
Yeah, this almost certainly is just the beginning of the litigation. I've called this solution basically a Band-Aid. It might buy a year or two of significant labor peace. We're already seeing, I've seen at least a dozen eligibility lawsuits filed. There's likely to be Title IX lawsuits filed challenging this. Part of the problem with this lawsuit was there wasn't a lot of guidance laid out on how schools are supposed to roll out this. So, the schools have a lot of autonomy. And when schools have a lot of autonomy, you end up with a lot of sort of different approaches to determining who gets what money. And that's undoubtedly going to lead to some additional lawsuits as well. And I think, one of the things that the NCAA is, I think they're just holding out hope that they can survive, is they desperately don't want athletes to be classified as employees. They fear that if athletes are employees, that's the next immediate threat that they see is the threat to college sports. Much like for 100 years, they insisted that athletes receiving any money was the threat to the existence of playing college sports. And so the NCAA desperately doesn't want them to be classified as employees. There's a lawsuit filed by a lawyer named Paul Anderson, presently arguing that NCAA athletes are employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. There are likely more lawsuits to come challenging this, because one of the things that we don't have clarity on is whether this House settlement itself turns some athletes into employees. And so this is undoubtedly going to be litigated by athlete plaintiffs, but we might also have the IRS come out and make a determination, because they have their own rules on who's classified as an employee versus a contractor, which the NCAA would like the athletes to be, because if someone's a contractor, you don't need to pay them benefits and they're sort of responsible for their own taxes and things like that. So the NCAA is very much holding out hope that they can avoid athletes being classified as employees. Long term, I don't think that's viable. And I think most people in college sports who are taking a realistic view of what the future holds recognizes that the only path forward with lasting labor peace, we'll call it, involves the athletes as employees, where they can form a collective bargaining unit, and through that collective bargaining unit, they can bargain with the NCAA member institutions over the terms of their employment. And this is how professional sports work. This is why we have every Major League Baseball team shows up every night to play games, because they have a collective bargaining agreement where they get paid a certain amount. They've all agreed to it. If they don't, there are these consequences. The owners can do this, they can do that. If there's a dispute, there's a resolution mechanism. What we have now is the NCAA basically imposing rules still and saying, well, you're not athletes, so we don't have to collectively bargain with you. But they're starting to basically provide all the benefits as though they were employees, minus perhaps some of the sort of, tax minutia and sort of state level filings and stuff that would see them as employees. So I don't think the future with college athletes as simply this term that the NCAA crafted of student athlete as something distinct from employee is likely to continue, at least for some athletes.
With that House settlement for 2025, this current sports season, basically each school is allotted $20.5 million, but that's for all the sport teams. And I mean, for some schools, I mean, I'm sure 85% of that will be divvied up for just say the football team. But also, you mentioned with the House settlement that there's now roster sizes. So does that mean like essentially the end of walk-ons? And then also, how is that money going to be divvied up? Does that mean that non-revenue generating sports how are they going to be impacted? Sports that, are kind of a pipeline for the Olympics, how are they going to be impacted? And then what about just like these smaller schools? Like this money's coming from the NCAA to these schools, correct? But if you're like, say, a smaller school, do you even get $20.5 million from the NCAA, or are you having to like foot the bill for this yourself? I mean, how does there's so many questions
with that money?
Yeah.
So that's not, the NCAA isn't cutting everyone a check for $20.5 million. Every school needs to come up with it. And my guess is there is not a college campus, perhaps with the exception of Ohio State, where they're not asking, where are we getting this money from? And, if you are a smaller school, I mean, if you look at even a school like Wake Forest, which has around 5,000 students, but they're a Division I school, I mean, you can't generate $20 million from upping student fees. That's going to be an astronomical amount per student. So schools are trying to wrap their head around this, and they don't have to provide this way. So it's optional. They can pay up to this amount. If schools don't want to, the reality of the market is that they won't have a lot of the top football or basketball players likely to go there where they can get that money elsewhere. And so every school is kind of figuring their own way out to find this money. And I think that's one of, at least anecdotally, the problems with this settlement is that, great, you can pay this money. Where's it coming from? And it's not coming from the NCAA. The NCAA doesn't have billions of dollars sitting in the bank account. A lot of that TV revenue comes in and then it gets shared out through the conferences, things like that. So there's not money to cut everyone a $20.5 million check, especially every year. And so what we are seeing is these roster caps came in, and with the roster caps, that's probably the end of walk-ons most places. I think, the 105 roster spots in football, these can all be scholarship athletes now. So there is undoubtedly added costs there. They have eliminated a cap on scholarships in baseball and put in a roster limit. So baseball used to only be allowed 11.7 scholarships. And the result of that was, even some of the best baseball players in the country were not on full scholarships because the team had to divide them. Well, now every player on a baseball team can have a full scholarship. So there's an ability for schools to spend a lot more money on college athletes. How many schools can do that? It's probably a handful. The rest are probably looking at ways that they can cut back. And that's going to probably take a couple of years for us to see the full effect of it. But it is a new world. And I think, for all the lip service that the NCAA has paid to sort of, we're really about opportunities and things like that. And Well, they were the ones that engaged in this settlement that will eliminate some opportunities when teams go away.
What would be like, say, the biggest, I don't know, three impacts that I mean, there's so many, but what would be like the biggest three? I mean, everyone wants to kind of know, like, what's the future of college sports going to look like? Of course, we don't know. There's going to be more settlements, but what right now would you say are the three biggest impacts?
Yeah, so I think the biggest impact that we'll see is we are going to see a small number of really highly paid athletes at certain schools. And that will be a monumental change. This will probably normalize over a couple of years. I think most places will probably not have a lot of really highly paid players and instead sort of have sort of even or closer to even pay just for a consistent roster. One of the other changes I think might be interesting to see is which schools decide to spend the money on something other than football and basketball. Which schools decide we are going to have the best women's softball team in the country and we are going to pay those athletes to come here. I think, that could be a really interesting impact of the House settlement. The third one, I think, is that the future is filled with more lawsuits. This is going to bring more challenges. And part of the reason it's going to bring more challenges is when you look at that pot of money. When you look at the professional sports leagues, at least the big four professional sports leagues of baseball, football, basketball, and hockey, their collective bargaining agreements see the players receive close to 50% of the revenues. Sort of back of the envelope math, the athletes here are probably getting about 20% of television revenue. That's a pretty big disparity from the professional level. I think at some point there is going to be more pushback from the athletes on the amount of money being distributed. I think what's going to happen is the television broadcast deals continue to grow. College football playoff, it sounds like it's going to keep growing. And that brings in more and more money every year. And with that, I think the athletes will again reach the point that we reached previously where they're saying, look at all this money coming in. Who's making that money? Well, it's the stars on the field and on the court that are bringing that money in. No one is coming to see the president of a university sit in a box or, I don't know if anyone's paying to see Dabo Sweeney on the sidelines. Like, no one cares about these coaches who are making millions. They're there to see the players. And so as that television money continues to grow, and we're already seeing like the shifts that are coming with that, with the new ACC agreement where, television ratings and on-field performance are going to determine the share of the revenue that schools get. We're seeing how college sports is shifting sort of the market dynamics already. And I think that's going to continue as this money starts to flow.
Who would you say are the big winners and the big losers in this? Are we going to see, like, setting the walk-ons seem like they're the losers if you're going to get rid of them? I mean, I would imagine there's going to be a lot of sports that are going to be cut or at least shrunk down. I mean, and the winners, obviously, I would be like the top athletes who are going to get paid millions of dollars.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at the losers, if we have to categorize them, those are going to be athletes in high-cost sports that cost a lot of money to put on, that don't generate revenue. We are going to see a lot of schools scale back those sports that cost a lot to put on, that aren't returning a profit to the school, that the school will then take a more probably exacting economic look at and decide we're just not going to offer this. And we've gone through this before. Men's swimming and diving has sort of been a frequently cut sport. Swimming generally. Gymnastics is down to basically a handful of programs in the country. It's expensive to run gymnastics. You need a specialized equipment, facility. It costs a lot of money. And so schools have made these determinations in the past that it's not worth us to field the gymnastics team anymore. And so I think you're going to see more of that. And that is something that I hope schools and the NCAA can find ways to minimize the impact on those athletes. And, one of the things being floated is this idea of sort of elevating club sports, which I don't think is a bad idea. But really, you don't want those athletic opportunities to go away from thousands of college students just because they don't play football or basketball. And in a very small number of places, a sport like baseball or hockey or, women's basketball. But really, when we're talking about the big winners here, I mean, it's going to be men's football players and men's basketball players, some women's basketball players, probably some softball, where we've seen Texas Tech throw a lot of money at softball. I'd expect the University of Oklahoma to do the same thing, sort of those storied programs. Some places are going to devote money to baseball and things like that. I haven't seen the same reaction for things like fencing, swimming and diving. There just hasn't been sort of the immediate reaction where some schools like, I'm going to double down and we are going to have a fencing program for the ages. Maybe that will happen. I think that would be kind of a neat thing if schools didn't all choose to go all in on football and basketball, and instead some schools decide we're going to be the stars of track and field. We're going to recruit the best track athletes in the world. So I think the winners in some ways are the athletes. I think one of the other major winners that doesn't get talked about quite as much are the professional sports leagues. And they benefit because now you have more athletes wanting to stay in school where they don't now need to receive those professional salaries because they're already getting paid. So they're continuing to develop without professional leagues footing the cost of that development. And, that's not cheap. If you look at a sport like baseball, which has, 4 at minimum, sometimes 5, 6 levels of development below the major leagues, they spend thousands of dollars developing players. If those athletes are now more likely to go to college and then stay in college 3-4 years, that's a huge boon to Major League Baseball. Same with the NBA. If basketball players are going to stay in college, continue to develop, well, then you don't need to devote those same development resources later because they're coming in as more mature players. So I think that's also one of the winners here that hasn't been talked about quite as much. But it's also pretty early in, and we don't know exactly who the winners and losers are going to be.
How is the NIL impacted by this? Because it seemed like there's now more restrictions or like compliance measures put into place. So how is that impacted?
Yeah, NIL was a huge shift to college sports and allowing athletes to monetize their name, image, and likeness rights, which was, really something that a lot of schools have been doing, right? I mean, when you turned in to watch a sporting event because it's the college that you cheer for, you were watching for the star players on that team. It wasn't like it was a bunch of anonymous people out there. You tuned in knowing those athletes. So really, their name, image, and likeness has been used. They're just now able to use it themselves for monetary gain. And So, I mean, from an economic rights perspective, this was huge. It was a pretty absurd policy, in my opinion, that the NCAA ever said, well, if you play college football, you can't be a model for Tommy Hilfiger, which was something they said to Jeremy Bloom back in the 90s was like, sorry, you might, that those two things have nothing to do with each other. Tommy Hilfiger doesn't care that he plays college football at the University of Colorado or that he's an Olympic skier. And his Olympic skiing has nothing to do with his college football. But the NCAA said, well, no, you can't get paid to promote products and play college football. And they were mutually exclusive things. And it just never made any sense. And so now that athletes are able to get money for endorsing products, endorsing services, I think that opened a lot of doors. I think one of the things we saw with the NCAA's, I think they basically threw their hands up and said, go ahead, do what you want, was you got a bunch of things that didn't look like traditional NIL. You had these collectives emerge, and it wasn't always clear what all these collectives were doing. Were they just giving checks to the players? Were the athletes doing anything? It really wasn't clear. I think the NCAA hopes that through this settlement, they're able to clear that up and there'll be less of that because, what the NCAA long feared was these bagmen that would deliver the duffel bag full of money to the locker after the football game. And they thought that would corrupt the sport. The reality of it is that the NCAA has always been misguided about why people watch college sports. I don't think we have any evidence that people won't watch college sports if athletes aren't paid. We know that athletes have been paid under the table for years. People still watch college sports. We now know athletes are being paid above the table and people are watching college sports. In fact, more people are watching college sports than ever. So, by that logic, the NCAA should really lean into this and just be like, yeah, there's no cap on this. It's whatever the free market sports. If you want to pay someone $10 million, go for it. But NIL has really changed it. And certainly there's been a couple of streams of NIL, if you will. There's sort of the standard, the athlete goes out, signs a deal with the local car dealership, signs some autographs for kids, takes some photos, maybe does a local ad or something like that. Those were sort of the bulk of these deals. There's small time deals for athletes. Then there are sort of the transcendent deals. Livy Dunn's deals. I mean, she's on television, in every television in this country with her apparel deals. We saw this was with Bryce Young when he was appearing in the Dr. Pepper ads. So there are a few transcendent athletes that have really been able to make, basically infinite money through their NIL. That's not most athletes. And most athletes didn't become millionaires in July 2021 when the NCAA threw its hands up. Most athletes probably got a little more spending money and made college a little easier, a little more comfortable. I don't think that for most college athletes, the House settlement is going to change that very much. I think one of the things we've already seen in sort of 4 years of NIL was that a lot of businesses that wanted to do more than basically just give money to students because they love the university probably didn't see a great ROI on, you aren't picking the hottest influencer in most cases. So it's not, from a business perspective, I never saw anything that indicated that, hey, yeah, outside of the Livy Dunns and Bryce Youngs of the world, that there was a lot of value in choosing a local college athlete over some other local celebrity. And so I think we were already sort of starting to see some of that roll back a little bit. Now it'll be different because we will have athletes paid directly by the schools for the first time ever. And it'll be interesting to see what that does on campus.
From like a coaching standpoint, recruiting standpoint, how big of changes is this for them? I mean, now, like, especially with the transfer portal where you could, spend all this time recruiting this player, all of a sudden they blow up and then some other school could offer them more money or better NIL deals. I mean, and then like the $20.5 million is basically allotted for the year. It's not like it's a 4-year guaranteed contract. So you could give them money. The next year, maybe another school offers them more money. So then they so it seems like, because I'm like, I'm from Wisconsin, so I'm a fan of the Green Bay Packers, and their defensive coordinator last year, Jeff Hafley, was the head coach at Boston College. And kind of the rumors were like, well, he didn't want to be a head coach and deal with all this stuff going on. And Nick Saban, everyone thought he was going to stick around longer, and it seems like he probably left because of this. So, I mean, and that's just two examples. Maybe that's not, uniform across college, but what do you think of that side?
I think Nick Saban's been fairly upfront that he does not care for what has happened. I think myself and a lot of people like myself said, well, you're making $11 million a year. I don't really care. If you don't want to make $11 million a year, go do game day and get whatever they're going to pay you. But there's a lot of people willing to do that job. And everyone's job changes. My job changes. I have new requirements every year that I have to do. If I don't like them, I can go find something else. That's the reality of this. And, business evolves, college sports evolves, professional sports evolves. If you don't like it, go do something else. Now, I think, it's long been talked about at the professional level. Coaches make less than the stars of the team. I mean, they're still able to coach. The recruiting aspect, that's evolved. I mean, it was college coaches who decided that we're going to hop on private planes all the time and fly all over the country to see these recruits. If you don't like it, talk to your other coaches, because that's who's doing it. It's, to me, complaining so that you can have an easier job while trying to deprive other people of benefits that you receive isn't a great argument for why we shouldn't do something. And, Nick Saban is an incredible football coach. If he wanted to still be coaching, he could still be coaching. But, the idea that it needs to be about something that he doesn't want to deal with NIL, well, too bad. Well, go find something else to do. And he has. I mean, is very rich at doing that. But I think that, college sports has always evolved. And we're just now getting to the point where the athletes are starting to have more rights and more of a voice. And when you look at how much revenue those athletes are driving, Nick Saban doesn't make $11 million a year without that team on the field. And so to start asking to receive a piece of that doesn't seem super unreasonable to me. And so I think, there will be complaints from coaches that don't like it. There will probably be some efforts to impose more standard contracts and things like that. But the reality of that complaint is that there's a really simple solution. And that's recognize the athletes as employees, let them form a union, and then collectively bargain with that union that you're only allowed one transfer or no transfers, or you sign 4-year contracts. You can do all that stuff. You just can't unilaterally impose it on a group when you collectively get together and do it, because that violates antitrust law. But there's an exception to antitrust law called the non-statutory labor exemption that basically says if there's a labor union and they're negotiating in good faith, well, then they can agree to stuff that would otherwise violate antitrust laws. Certain stuff, anyways, in terms of labor are one of those things. So, that's the fix here. But they can't do it without the players being part of a union. And so that's been one of the things that I've tried to talk their ear off about, is that, this is probably the actual solution that brings you lasting peace and gets you the things you want. You just have to negotiate it and recognize that these people that you are now paying money are actually employees. So to me, that's where we're headed at some point. I don't know if we get there voluntarily or if the IRS, some court, basically forces us there. I think we get there eventually. I just don't know how or when.
These schools don't have to opt into this. What do you think the future is going to hold? And you think you're going to see where just in 5 years from now, you're just not going to have many schools opting in if they're required to dish out, who knows at that time, maybe, it's 22 million or whatever or more. Do you think you'll just see a bunch of schools opt out of this?
I don't. I think there will be some that choose to. There'll be some that say, we're going to go from Division I to Division III. I wouldn't expect many in the Power 5 to say, no, we're not going to do this. Schools will find a way to make it happen. Sports are really important to campus communities. Alumni bases love sports. I would be very surprised if anyone in the Power 5 or Power 4, I don't know if we call the Pac-12 part of the Power 5 again, I can't really tell. If anyone there says, no, we're just going to step back from this. We don't want to be competitive. Because the reality of it is, there's been no indication that Ohio State, Michigan, LSU aren't prepared to pay whatever they can. And as long as they're prepared to pay whatever they can, everyone else that wants to be them or be like them is going to do the same thing. And a lot of the Power 5, I mean, if the University of Texas came out, I'm sure they'd have 40 donors lined up to pay the whole amount if they said, no, we can't afford this. That's not everyone's situation. And there probably will be some smaller schools that make a choice not to do this. Some will drop down. Some will just basically be like, we're going to pay a reduced amount or we're going to pay nothing at all. Come here if you want to play. The reality, though, is that at least people will be making informed decisions. It won't be, people restricted from earning. They will know what they're agreeing to when they go to a school.
As an actual professor, I imagine that you must have like students at Indiana University where you teach. I mean, do you have any athletes in your classes? And you must talk to parents and stuff. What's kind of like the general feel or vibe when you actually talk to people? I mean, this is a pretty interesting topic. Like what's kind of the main either points of concern or things they enjoy about this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly talk generally. I don't talk a lot to parents I think, talking to students generally, they're all kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. It's a lot of this we're still finding out on the fly. There's not a ton of information, at least with the House settlement. Every school is kind of figuring it out on their own from what I can tell. So, there's a lot of wait and see. I also think there's probably not a generalizable reaction, at least from athletes. And I don't really have a lot of one-on-one conversations with athletes, but, my guess is if you're on the football team, your experience is going to be different than someone on the softball team, and that's going to be different from someone on cross country, and that's going to be different from swimming and diving. So I think it's going to be really individualized. I don't think from college sports on campus, especially at like a Big Ten school where I'm at, you're going to see it's going to look I don't think it'll look very different to you. I think it's going to, when you show up, I mean, in Wisconsin, Camp Randall on Saturday at noon or 4 hours before that, whatever the case may be, I think it's going to feel the same as it did this year and the year before and a decade before that. I don't think that commercial aspect of the game is really going to appear to the fans. I think it's going to be the same. I think the broadcasts are going to talk about it a little more, but I don't think it's going to impact the quality of the product at all.
Yeah, I think if you're talking about like the big programs, like no one's probably going to notice the difference. But if you're going to some mid-major or, like in Wisconsin, I mean, you could go to UWGB or something. I mean, that's going to be vastly different than if you're going to Wisconsin, Madison versus going to, I don't know, like Appalachia State or something like that, right?
Yeah, and that's what we don't know at this point. We don't know. Appalachian State's probably a good example because they are a team that really performs above sort of the typical mid-major program in football, at least. We don't know, are they going to continue to do that? Are they going to find the resources to be at the top of the mid-majors every year? I don't know. That's something that we'll have to watch. I think at some point we might see some schools, just as they basically decide how can we sort of maximize what we have, we might see more schools move their football teams down so as not to feel the need to compete. My inclination, without looking into it at all, would be that a school like App State, which has this pretty good history of college football success, is probably going to do what they can to continue to at least stay at the top. And what we might end up seeing are basically tiers of how schools are allocating money. And so, if you can allocate, let's call it 20 million, maybe we see some mid-majors at the top basically devoting 10 million to football. And so I think, the question of scale is one that we're waiting to see.
The whole student athlete thing, I mean, it doesn't seem like at this point that, I mean, I guess that terminology probably hasn't been accurate for decades, but I mean, you're kind of like projecting out like maybe at some point they will just be employees, they'll have contracts. What does that mean though for like the academic side of things? If that's the case, I mean, how do you make employees go to class and things like that? Of course, even at the big schools, they don't even go to class anyways, right? Don't they have a test taker that sits in place for them? I mean, that's what I would always hear from my athlete friends, that they don't even go to class.
One of the big things that we've seen in college generally has been the ability to take classes online has really sort of changed sort of college athletics. And when the Big Ten became this national conference and you've got UCLA flying to Rutgers or Oregon flying wherever, I mean, how are those athletes supposed to be like any other student on campus? They physically can't attend class when you've got a 7-hour plane ride to go play a sporting event. You come back for a day, then you have to do it again. And so I think it was during March Madness this year, it said at least one of the teams, basically all their basketball players were enrolled in online classes. And I think that's becoming fairly common. I don't have any idea what the ratios are, even on my own campus. I don't know. But the demand for online classes is high generally. Students like the flexibility. I think the athletic departments like the flexibility. The other reality is that college sports is a job. And, whether the NCAA recognizes it or not, those athletes are engaged in their sport, whether directly or indirectly, a lot more than the time that they're playing games or just practicing. Whether it's weight room, whether it's, dietitians, whether it's, mental aspects of the game, athletes are doing this 40 plus hours a week. They're focusing on this, so I think what is a college athlete has already changed. That ship has sailed a long time ago. And really, I don't think you can go back in the box. And there's been a criticism that what will it be like if you've got millionaires sitting in class with these other students who have to take out student loans? And the reality of that is that probably already happens. There are probably already kids in class that have $1 million and other kids that don't. And sorry, I shouldn't use kids. Students in class that are more fortunate than others financially, and that's kind of the nature of college. So I also don't think that's a good reason to not pay people just because they'd have more money than other people. So the ship has already sailed on athletes having money in college. I think the real question that becomes is, where do we go from here? I think that basically the future of college sports is with athletes as employees. I think for the NCAA and its member institutions, its conferences, the sooner they recognize that and the sooner they embrace it, the faster we get to a point where they get a lot of the things they want. They get that stability of, dealing with the transfer portal. They get to impose whatever academic requirements they want because they have a union that will agree to those things. I don't think the athletes would fight them on a lot of these things. If you're talking to athletes about whether they like the transfer portal, I would guess that most athletes want their teammates to come back next year. So, I think that there are reasonable solutions out there if both sides can come together and agree. And I think, I don't think college sports is going away. It's evolving, but I think, we saw the NCAA finally embrace change when it agreed to the House settlement. I think it could make a real step forward to sort of protecting the existence of college sports by recognizing student athletes, college athletes as employees and engaging in collective bargaining with them. And I really think that's the path forward.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.